Hello, YouTube. Thank you for being here. I'm so excited to have Dr. Cori Wong with us again, one of my favorite people on the planet. Dr. Cori Wong is a philosopher, educator, and thinker, and just a really nice friend. So I'm really happy that you're here, Cori. And we talk about a ton of stuff the last time you were here on the value of teachers and how teachers transform us, the power of levity, language, philosophy as an art of living, love that, and how this connects to therapy and liberation. I wanted to kind of start by just hearing how you are and see where you might want to take this conversation today. Thank you again for being here.
Yeah, well, thank you. Happy always to be in conversation with you. After our last conversation, I was on such like a high from it for so long. I watched the conversation multiple times over, had many different thoughts, and a couple of things that stood out to me about the conversation, they jumped out really early. We were talking about our shared former professor at Colorado State University, Dr. Marion Codron. And there was something that I wanted to touch base on around that because there was something really important of our conversation around values, identifying values, and like what that means. So on one hand, I'm just jumping in right away to like, here's the things that I was thinking about from our last conversation.
Let's do it.
There was an awkward moment in our conversation, I think, because I was like starting to ramble a little bit. Like I was just like, let me just start talking about all these things. But in the back of my mind, I knew where I was going and I knew what I was doing. And you're just such a patient listener that you were like, okay, we're going here. But it was when we were talking about identifying values. And then I started to bring up Dr. Codron and Dr. Dean and like kind of the differences of kind of philosophical backgrounds or traditions of where people are coming from. But beneath all of that word stuff was really the intention to make a connection around how I think that when we find our values or identify our values, it's really through a diligent, disciplined practice. And that was, I wanted to bring that up because I think when we were talking about the key wisdom that we got from Marion Codron, and just because this is a follow-up conversation, I'll read what I wrote in my journal from 2006 that we were referencing in our last conversation. Okay.
Wonderful.
So in February of 2006, I wrote in a journal after a conversation with Dr. Codron this: let the searching begin. Dr. Codron instructed me to start writing my thoughts down in addition to reading and volunteering in order to prepare me for any form of graduate school. To figure out what I'm going to do for the rest of my life, she told me to order my values 1 through 5, then use my gifts and talents to power me towards fulfilling my values. So what I wanted to highlight is that, like, as we were talking about values and how important they are and how like they're kind of the foundation for, basically it was the conversation we had. We just kept circling back around to it. That little tangent that I sort of went to was intended to be some kind of articulation about how we come to find our values though. And I know you had referenced like an online tool through the positive psychologists of figuring out what your values are. And that was sticking with me because I think it's so important for us to actually do the work to develop our values. It's not something that I think that we can just identify and say, I guess these are the things that are the most important to me. In order for that to do the meaningful work of connecting to some purpose or understanding how to align our gifts and talents with the kind of life work that we want to be doing. So by bringing in Dr. Codron and Dr. Dean and kind of the philosophical experience over the years of learning and reading and thinking and teaching and doing all of this practice, it's now that I feel clear on my values, but it's from a whole process of like moving through what it means to identify and articulate values. I think that they've been operating in the background in various ways. There's probably a whole suite of some of them, but to get to be able to a refined list of 5 has been a journey over years that now I feel confident articulating that. But it wasn't because I was just like looking at a list of words and picking out the ones that I liked the most. So it was one piece I wanted to bring up about values, that I think that we need to, because our values are so important for grounding us in work that's meaningful and purposeful, really make space for the journey of like getting into a deep relationship of understanding and knowing our values through a kind of experiential process I think that's a significant thing to set people up for if we really want to figure out our purpose, figure out our values by doing some work.
And
But
so, go ahead, please.
the other thing I wanted to emphasize too is that like I don't want to dismiss the other pieces of advice that came from Dr. Codron in that journal entry. Yeah. When she said to write down thoughts, read, and volunteer, in addition to identifying values. It wasn't just figure out what your values are and then put your talents to it. There were, I think the writing down your thoughts, you know this because we've talked about it, it's part of the writing workshop or the wisdom workshop. Yeah. And the books we reference from writing down the bones, like how important it is to be able to go through a sort of repetitious daily practice of articulating through the act of writing something about your own, as we said in the last conversation, self-authorship too. So I really loved that was part of what I wrote in the journal. So I wanted to highlight that again. It's like, there's also the advice from our wise teacher of writing down your thoughts, reading to get continuous exposure and be part of that learning, that I think also these writing and reading help you in the journey of identifying values, and then volunteering as an act of service to be in connection with others and community. And that came up a little bit in the ways that we were talking about, even Dr. Codron, but kind of like the therapeutic practice of helping people or healing and what that looks like. So I just I was a little bothered afterwards to be like, I think we didn't do that justice because we fixated so much on how important it is to know your values, but kind of we went too quickly over the steps to get to identifying your values. I can pause there because I have one more thing to add to the Marion Codron connection.
Well, I think I don't want to lose this point now that you've so wonderfully brought it up, because I wonder if there's other ways to determine our values that beyond reading, writing, and volunteering. I really like those points, and I really like the idea of volunteering, partially because it also takes the focus off of ourselves. I think when we're thinking about, if I ask someone what their values are, or ask myself what my values are, it seems like this process that is self-referential and that it's like about me, which is true, but this is why I love conversations and group dynamics and community, where we kind of find ourselves in community or we find ourselves in service, kind of taking the focus off of us as a way of finding ourselves, quote unquote, nice Buddhist metaphysics. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to add, I would add like projects as well. So creating something, building something, making something that you want to fail, doing something where you're not focused on doing it well, you're just focused on doing it, to learn, I think is another really powerful way that I can think of that has helped me kind of really clearly articulate where I feel like I'm in my strength. I'm expressing these signature strengths versus not.
Well, yeah, I think that the creating a project that you could have fail is, for me, that's reflective of my own value on creativity. And I think that's a shared value that we have. So maybe that's more reflective of your value, and then it allows you to tap into your strengths, your gifts and talents, to be able to propel towards that value. I think the volunteering piece is important too, because there are lots of different ways to be of service and to engage with others and be in community. But something important about volunteering is that it's like sort of by definition not goal oriented towards making money to fulfill your own ends. So it's not like a side hustle, and it's not something that you need or want to pursue with the intention of like your career work. But it's I think it creates a different kind of channel for engagement when it's something that we do just with others, not for the purposeful end of making money or needing to satisfy our basic needs for food and shelter and all those other things that can kind of get in the way of us truly being able to know, align with, and then like live out our values because of the external forces that are always pressing on us that we need to be, navigating in order to survive too. So I think there's a window there in that volunteering category that should feel a little bit different than, something that's, what do you do for your job, or what do you do to try to make money, basically.
right? Or as a side hustle, is that immediate temptation is how could I use this to expand my reach or to,
Yeah.
which might not be actually what you care about at all. It might just be an internalized
Yeah.
metric from this attention economy that we are,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Yeah, or
living.
I think those influences may distort our process
Right. That's
rather
right.
than help us clarify, going through a kind of practice or discipline journey, or just being open to the experience in ways that will help us better identify what our true core values actually are. Because maybe we have them again, or we develop them through these experiences, but that distortion, I think, is what we need to be careful of, because people might be internalizing different kinds of cultural values that they say they believe in just because that's, what we've adopted or ascribed to. So anyway, I wanted to make a note about that because it felt really important to me to be able to say, no, values are so significant and so important that we also need to recognize that there's a practice itself of getting to a point of knowing and understanding our values. The other thing about Dr. Cadron that I wanted to share that has been, it was after the fact that I realized it. I love teaching, you love teaching. I know we both take it really seriously. And there was a part in our conversation where we were talking about what philosophy does. And I think we've had this come up too, of like, I really make the point that philosophy is a disciplined activity. It's like something that we do. And it's coming from a lineage, and there's history, and there's like all this stuff that's not just like sitting around and thinking. But the conversation we were having last time, you were like, yeah, when we're teaching, like, what happens if we've read Nietzsche? Do we just like agree or disagree? And you even caught yourself when you're like, it's funny that I went to a place of being like, we just started where we ended, but now we can say whether or not we agree with it. And I think that that struck a chord for me, because when I'm teaching theory and philosophy, I'm usually pretty explicit, like at the very first day of the semester, to say, my goal here is not to indoctrinate you or even really be all that committed to you believing the arguments of the people that we're reading. Like, I don't like doing philosophy in that way. It's not a kind of critical analysis of specifically their arguments to just say how they got it wrong. I think it's funny that like undergrads who have never read something read one essay and can disprove suddenly like a great thinker. So rather than approaching philosophy as this kind of like debate or skill development and debate, Dr. Cadron, when she taught classes, she said that this is when she told me to major in philosophy, that story, when I was like, what is philosophy? She said, if you major in philosophy, it'll teach you how to read, write, and think. And those are the most important things. So what I didn't realize when we were talking, it took me a while to remember this. When I teach, I start every semester by saying, my objective for all of us here is not for you to know 100% perfectly with accuracy the intentions and the words of these specific thinkers and their arguments. What I want us to get out of this experience is for you all to develop your skills in being able to read, write, think, and then listen and articulate or speak your own thoughts clearly. So I've added listening and sharing or expressing your own ideas to the core basic skills that Dr. Cadron told me I should do philosophy for, reading, writing, and thinking. And I just love that, because I was like, oh my gosh, I've always felt influenced by my teachers, even in how I teach, but that is a direct correlation to what she did with me. And I've carried it into every classroom I've ever led for over a decade since, about core skills: read, write, think, speak, and listen clearly.
That's so cool. I mean, it's giving me chills because I've been thinking about creating a course or a series of content on how to read more effectively. And around not only when you're reading a text well, I think we have a very narrow definition of reading. And if we expand other ways we use reading in the English language, and we have to do this as a class, what other ways do we use the verb to read? You're not just reading books, right? What else do we read?
Yeah, read the room,
read a person.
Yeah.
What else? Read a defense if you're playing basketball, which I think is a really interesting one. In all the situations, you are quickly assessing what's there and then deciding how you're going to make the next move that you make. So when I pick up this book to read, the first thing I do is the table of contents to see what's there, make adjustments on how I'm moving through each of it based on that. And that's a skill that most undergrads have not really thought about reading as a way of processing information about a situation, a person, a text, a tradition. not to be like, oh, I can disprove this, but to
Yeah.
practice. It's like we're navigating this sea of information in an active and interesting, almost going to say critical, but I would almost emphasize a more creative way of being like, I'm actually going to choose to move this direction. I'm going to choose to underline this with this mark because that's how I'm engaging with the text.
Engaging is a key word. The other word that's coming up for me is attunement. When you're like, read a room or read a
Yes.
person, it's like, if you're not reading what a person is presenting in terms of their verbal or nonverbal body language, just the context, like, then you are not attuned well enough to be able to make meaning of the relationship that you have with that situation or how you can show up. I like to think about relationships as, you know, feminist friendship stuff of like building intimate bonds of understanding across differences so that we can show up for each other better. So if you're reading a book just to consume it and disprove it, or in the way like read a book like you're hiking a summit, you know, just to conquer it and say you did it, then you don't have that kind of attunement and like kind of engaged relationship with it to be able to be in the experience, make meaning, maybe even foster a deeper connection with what is available in that moment.
Do you think you can have conversations with texts?
Oh yes, definitely.
So you ask questions of texts?
I don't even know if it's so much like a conversation. I said yes emphatically to that because I feel like text and broadly thinking text like film or other kinds of mediums too, like we bring so much of ourselves into any interaction with the text that we have a lens that we're engaging with it. So 5 years later or whatever, or a second time around, even immediately following the first interaction, different kinds of nuance and meaning will come through because our understanding and our perspective has shifted. So it's like you're hearing it again or hearing it differently. And then you can see and engage differently too. So if that's asking the question or just participating with stronger emphasis on certain topics or new, I mean, that's what makes good text so good, is that they're rich enough that you go back to and go like, wow, still more here, still more. And that's what makes relationships so rewarding, because it's like, oh, I thought I already knew you, but there's so much here, there's more here, and it still feels new, it feels generative, it feels inspiring, it feels revelatory. Like there's a lot that could come out of this way to be attuned, engaged, present, and interacting in a reciprocal kind of relationship with all of these various different texts, people, environments, circumstances.
So yeah, we took a philosophy of Tao and Zen with Marion Codron, and the Tao Te Ching, the famous text from Laozi from 6th century BC. She introduced it as a magic mirror. This text is a magic mirror.
Yeah.
More than any other text that I know of. In that what you see when you pick up and read this text is you and your situation. And that's so cool because that is really, I think, the real act of philosophy in some kind of self-referential way, is when I'm reading, I'm not just reading this text, I'm beginning to gain a familiarity with reading my reaction to this text as a kind of ground for investigation and inquiry, which is the same thing why we use a writing practice, where I'm able to write one, and then I can read or write my reaction to that, knowing that if I'm going to write my reactions to it in an existential sense, it's going to take kind of habituation, practice, psychometric designing.
This is the basic form of meditation. I mean, if you listen to Alan Watts, one of the most like publicly popular philosophers, if you will, of talking about like the self-observing itself, you know, that or just an act of meditation, part of the practice is to observe and recognize where the activity is with a conscious awareness, so that you can now like have some slight separation from it, so that you're not in it, but you're observing it. And so reading gives us that opportunity to have that level of awareness. Writing definitely does, meditation does, but it's like creating enough space for us to, you said self-referential, and I think that's appropriate in the way of the kind of bearing witness to recognize where we are, the we. I would think about no independent self or soul. Like, that's, whatever. We're getting real deep into.
Yeah, let's keep your metaphysics out of this, Cori. Yeah. We're just joking. What's funny and interestingly is that making me remember Marion Codron's teacher, who's also my first teacher, Jim Boyd, Dr. Jim Boyd and Ron Williams at Colorado State University. The dominant question I remember them asking in the traditional world philosophy is how much, and this would be a good one to kind of move into your work with feminist friendship as well, or at least touch on that again. Take an example. They study Shinto fire ritual. Mm-hmm. Shinto, the native, I don't want to call it a religion, don't want to call it a philosophy, maybe more of like a sentiment worldview, kind of this native worldview of Japan. Mm-hmm. And they're doing ritual studies, and they're studying Shinto fire rituals, which is some of the last scholarship that Jim Boyd and Ron Williams published. Their question as philosophers and scholars, behind all their questions about how does the fire ritual work, is how much can I and how respectfully can I enter into another person's lens of experience? What does it mean to be in, you were talking about traveling in Lugones, that idea last time. How much can I approach the fire ritual with a respect? Is it possible for me to see the world from this? How can I see the world from this perspective? Like put on these different glasses to see this ritual as they're seeing it, as a way of understanding what it is that they're doing. So in this sense, philosophy isn't just reading, writing, thinking, listening, sharing. It's perspective considering, perspective entering. And that was the open question that they framed it, that I keep on coming back to, is how much can we? How much can we approach, and not from an appropriation perspective, but from an enriching perspective? That move of understanding the way another person sees the world is, to me, what's so fascinating about comparative world religious studies, or even traditional philosophy.
I think my face is doing a lot right now.
I know. I feel like trying to. I've only been able to notice some of it, and I can attest it is doing a lot.
Yeah, fascinating.
Should we do a new question?
No, because there's something.
Okay,
a lot's coming up for me. That's why my face is making moves. Because there's all right, let's see if I can articulate this. So one of the things when we were talking about Maria Lugones last time, it was from talking about the decolonial turn. And that paragraph that I read of all these questions of the questions come up then and we have to figure out the answers. But to summarize one of the questions that I think when it comes to a decolonial approach, it's how do we be in relationship with each other, especially across differences and cultural differences, without consuming or dominating one another? That's what I heard when you said not in an appropriative kind of way. Yep. But the reason why my face was making strange formations was because there's something that bothers me about talking about taking on somebody else's perspective or seeing the world through their lens. Yeah. I don't know that I've ever really registered this as bothering me so much until I heard you say it so many times.
Awesome. Amazing. Glad I could do that for you.
Because to me it feels so risky, where I don't want someone to step inside of my view and see the world from my eyes. Yeah. I want someone to see me. And so I feel when you're how to do Boyd and Williams' question, how can we get to understand this practice? Is it appropriate? The first thought that came to my mind, the first visual was sure, if someone invites you in, is here, stand next to me. Right? Yes. Don't become in me and see through my eyes. because then where do I go? Like, that's literally like a metaphor for imperialism. Like, you are colonizing inside of me, but I would rather you stand next to me
Awesome.
and see what this means for me. So it's like to see through somebody else's eyes is to eliminate them rather than seeing them and the significance and meaning that some cultural practice has for them because it is so important to them. So you're preserving the integrity of the person or the people. You're understanding the people and not trying to like get into their perspective. And that might seem like subtle nuance, or maybe we're saying the same things, but it lands really differently for me.
I think it's a big distinction. I honestly
Yeah,
think that spatial awareness of being shoulder to shoulder, so there is a sense of communion that we're in this together, looking at the same thing, makes a lot of sense to me, rather than a displacement happening right in the.
even with that, it's like, okay, so if we're standing next to each other, we could be looking at the same thing. And it would be helpful to recognize that you can't get out of your own perspective either, right? You're
Yes.
still going to be looking at it in your own perspective. But if we're looking at the same thing, here's what I also want you to do. And here's what I could do. So we could see each other. That's that's the yes. And you were good to kind of anticipate this and say maybe this touches on feminist friendship, and I didn't know where you were going to go with that, but I think that is the obvious connection there, that it really is for me about like how can we get better at really seeing each other across our differences so that we're not missing each other, projecting onto each other, dominating one another, or saying, I need you to be these things for me, but instead having enough grace and love and respect to truly witness someone as they are in themselves, to the degree that they'll share themselves with us, right? And are we developing our skills and sensitivities enough to be able to see them when they do, so that from that comes a sense of relationship, connection. And I was literally just on a phone call with somebody else, we were talking about this, and I said, I really emphasize that, but like the point is not just to have the connection. Yes, I believe in relationship. Yes, I love intimacy, and I do truly really value relationship in terms of like the connection that we can share with people, but it's not just for the sake of the connection itself. It's so that we can do something out of that to me bridges more towards how we can build a liberatory world, that we have connection in a world that tries to separate us. Yes, that's itself important and valuable, but it's out of the connections that we can form in this more intimate and honest, truthful, authentic, loving way, that then we can do things together. We can support each other. We can we can collaborate together. We can create together. We can be together. We can show up for one another. We can love each other much better from that place of seeing each other. So it's not just now I've got a friend and I know who they are. It's now I have a friend and I know who they are well enough to be able to support their needs, and we support each other. Like, we take care of each other. We uplift one another. We do something out of that connection.
And we know that we care about the same rough things, in the sense if we're building something, not just for creativity's sake, because I like to paint, but for Liberatory's sake, because I believe that everyone should have access to this kind of education, or whatever that care is, right? That sense of moving forward towards something that we both and I'm saying both in an expansive sense, not just you and I, but in the community of practice that we find ourselves in, who really like, and then, I mean, it does raise the question of what those values are. I was about to say who really like playing World of Warcraft, because a lot of this research on affinity groups is from the online gaming community. You want people to have a sense of real community online, have them play the same game. If we love World of Warcraft, we already have like something community, even if I'm like a level 60 warlock and you're a noob. I don't even know if that's a real thing.
Either.
So then, I mean, it really re-raises the question about what are we doing here? why, or at least my identifying values again, not just for me, but do I have a point? Is there a point where the philosopher studying the function of rituals from northern Colorado is able to stand alongside the traditional Shinto priest that is blessing people's automobiles before they leave? Where's that connection? And maybe that's an extreme example, but I don't think so. I think it really is this question of, under the banner of love potentially, or liberation, or equality, would all be potentially, like, does that make sense? You're doing more with your face.
This is one of my strengths and my weaknesses as a teacher. I do not hold my face well. So the students would often be like, we watched her face and could tell either I was loving it or I was like, I don't know about that. But I'm not like
Sure.
judging anything that you're saying. It's just the thing that's coming up for me is like, I think about how, like in the United States, racism and white supremacy is like so real. And so I think a lot about whiteness. I think a lot about white people. I think a lot about white supremacy. And I have a lot of ideas for how, like, white folks or people of whiteness, which I grew up in so much whiteness. So, like, my work matters to me on this because I have been dismantling and understanding and trying to break through the whiteness that I've internalized just because I grew up how I did in this country. Like, there's so much that we can offer people of whiteness, which is my language instead of just white people. That's how I like to talk about it. So that we can engage in racial justice or efforts for racial justice in more meaningful ways than being like, hey, I'm a white person and I want to be like cool with people of color. So can I like stand next to you now? Like, I'm trying to think of like kind of parallel examples of what you're talking about. Like, can you and the Shinto like priest, like when and how do we stand next to people, and why are we doing that? It feels awkward, honestly, if we're not doing it for the right reasons because we don't know how to stand next to each other, or if we think that just standing next to each other is somehow the goal. So when I put it in terms of like race relations in the United States and white people wanting to be like, can I be like here next to you? That gets questionable in terms of its authenticity and integrity when it's like, but why are you standing here? To have proximity to me so that people see us together, so that you feel better because now you're close to me? Or are you like actually standing here because I want you here for what you bring to this space, and you want to be here for what you value in us doing this together, like recognizing the importance of us standing together? Those are just deeper questions that I think get at the like meaning of the relationship, that is what the doing the work of like racial justice actually refers to. It's not just be a better white person. It's like do the work to understand what it means to be a white person standing next to people of color for racial justice. And how you show up there is what's going to determine if it's appropriate, comfortable, or even like reasonable for you to be in proximity in that way. That was a lot of.
Would you say that that's and I like that. Would you say that's partially a function of my ability to listen and be curious about how? Because I think the other thing, what I have heard and seen, is that there is a will and an interest to help and to be good. I basically want to be a good person, but I literally don't know how to in this context, because it seems like either the goalposts are shifting, or I just don't know how. I want to help. How can I help?
Right. You and I, we've had these conversations before. These are like the unreleased recorded conversations in 2020, where we've talked about this and whiteness has come up more explicitly. And it's like, yeah, I know people want to be a good person and they want to help. And yes, to a certain degree, it's amount of listening, but like below that is really a will to change. Like it's, I think it reflects the similar kind of parallel of like, we got to go deeper than. We got to go deeper than just hearing, because people have been screaming, shouting for centuries. What's not okay? And the things that are not changing is not that people aren't screaming loud enough for people to listen and hear. What's not changing is that, in a racial context of white supremacy, is that like white supremacy is not going anywhere. White people are not changing their relationship to white supremacy. People of color aren't changing their relationship to white supremacy in some cases. And so when we talk about like a decolonial churn or dismantling white supremacy, what that requires is changing your behavior. And I believe in the context of feminist friendship, this is always that kicker, that Lugonis and Spellman, when they wrote that essay in 1983, what got me so intrigued about it is that they said, you know, they called out white women. White women are not prepared to actually show up appropriately in these dynamics. They need to be able to approach any kind of relationship with the motivation of friendship out of friendship. And it's likely not possible because they haven't developed the skills to be able to genuinely enter into a friendship out of friendship relationship with us in order for us to actually be able to do this work together. And so if we extrapolate that and say on a larger scale of like, white people want to do good, be helpful, don't know what to do, it's like you haven't developed the skills yet to show up differently. So we can't have a kind of, we're going to stand next to each other and it's going to feel awkward in the meantime until it goes from listening to learning to understanding. Again, not just seeing the world from a person of color's eyes, but seeing yourself in the world as a white person and understanding that's your relationship to white supremacy, a magic mirror everywhere, and then changing and adjusting because of that. That's the practice of literal change. The will to change, connected to love. I know we wanted to bring this up, but like bell hooks, a lot of people talk about the will to power, the will to know, the will to truth, and bell hooks wrote a book on the will to change. I haven't read it, so full disclosure, but it's directed towards men and masculinity. But what I do know and appreciate about that is that the will to change for me obviously connects to the definition of love that bell hooks has helped me understand and develop for myself. So this is all going to connect.
Can you share that, the definition of love?
Yeah. So if I'm remembering correctly, Eric Fromm and Scott Peck, I don't know if I'm remembering that one exactly, but bell hooks is coming from many other people who have talked about the will to love, or as love as the will to extend oneself for one's own or another's spiritual growth or development. And then I have taken what I have learned from bell hooks and all the other influences of my life to recognize, now I say the will to love is that love is the will to extend oneself for one's own or another's healing, transformation, or liberation. So it's not just spiritual development, because I feel like that can have a lot of different connotations and some limitations, but the will to extend oneself for one's own or another's liberation, which we could say involves healing and transformation, that is reflective much more of what it means to be a good person who wants to help. Then you've got to love enough to be able and willing to change through the will to extend oneself actively with the choice, through action, with practice, either for your own transformation and another's. So we're not separated in that effort. We have to transform with others and want to encourage others' transformation for liberation too. But it has to be that activeness of the will, which is very much more than just listening, right?
Yeah, and it's like volunteering, honestly, or at least it ties back to that being willingness to spend our time in some point of service for another.
And yeah, to extend oneself. Yeah. I assume in that maybe someone's like, all right, I extended myself once, but I internalize that as like the will to extend oneself is a repetitious practice, developing habit. It's discipline, it's ongoing, it's iterative. And we continually extend ourselves for this level of growth or transformation, healing, and liberation for ourselves and others.
So how do we develop the skills of friendship for being friend, how did you say that? The motivation of friendship out of friendship, the kind of
Mm.
being how we're not really able, a lot of us, to show up, or that it takes a certain amount of skill, a skill set.
Hmm. I think that you know, I waffle a little bit sometimes back and forth between like why friendship is so important to me, in the as like a model for relationship and connection and intimacy, because it's also, I think, a lot about like romantic relationship and
Yeah.
partnerships too, and then there's community. But I think friendship is really integral to all of it, because it's um, a romantic relationship should be based on a friendship too, I think.
Yeah.
So anyway, we'll just
Agreed.
go with that and say, how do we show up as friends? What I like about friendship, Uma Narayan has a piece on working together across difference, where she articulates a couple of pieces about friends where like we have more grace for our friends,
Mm.
rather than like strangers who upset us and like cross the line or whatever, and we just like, I don't have time for you then. Like, nope. But there's a little bit more grace and patience for our friends when we're learning. You often care about your friend for their own sake and their own interest. You know, it's like not to get something out of the relationship like you would if you're networking or something, but you know, it's like the friendship out of friendship really implies centering the relationship of a friendly kind of rapport. And it has the sense of, I think, a willingness to be with and accept people as they are, rather than trying to make them something for you, like we were talking about earlier at the start of the conversation. It requires, I mean, friendship has one other theme that we talk about a lot around play and like fun,
Mhm.
a sort of levity to it. Friendship has an ongoing kind of quality that's not, I think, overridden by governmental legal contracts and structures, or even other kinds of traditional institutions, like even religion, you know. I feel like friendship captures just so much more of like the want to be together
Yes.
because you like each other and you love each other and you have nothing tethering or influencing what you can do then together as friends. You know,
So
go on adventures, you can just sit, you can hang out, you can do all sorts of things as friends.
one of companion, or like to eat, to break bread with. I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking of another sense of sharing in that
Yeah.
regard. So is do we do this by just do we practice this by just doing it, by like going out there and making friends? Like, how do we do all those things? Just find somebody's hand and squeeze it while there's still time, kind of.
That's always the risk. Whenever I talk about feminist friendship, people are like, I guess, especially because it's usually in the context of race, like dynamics, that people are like, I guess I need to go find a person of color to be friends with. Like, no,
No.
not that tokenizing thing. Don't do that. That's like the one thing we shouldn't do. Please don't do that. I think to be friendly, you know, like let's use us as an example, right? Like, I think you're a friend. We don't hang out. We've known each other for a long time now, but we've had limited interactions. But it's like in order to build a friendship, I think you have to have shared interests, probably to some degree, some shared values, at least the value of wanting to connect and be with each other. That has to be a shared value. Otherwise, you're not really going to be friends. And then like the openness, I think a lot of people struggle to make and be friends because we don't have the ability to be open and vulnerable and authentic and like and care for each other. I mean, your friends are the people who you talk to when you need talking to. Your friends are the people who are going to laugh at the same things that you laugh at because they see what you see, you know, like but if we don't know who we are, it's hard to be in relationship with anyone, I think. And most of our relationships, I have been thinking about this a lot, the idea that like we heal or we do more growth for relationships in relationship. Like, you need to be in relationship to practice it. You can't like think your way about relationships. There is a lot of like practicing by doing it. You have to be in a relationship, and then that's how you grow in relationship with others. So you heal in relationship. You can get hurt in relationships too. That's why a lot of people avoid them. But like you can't, I don't think it's as if you can really heal and love unless you're in relationship doing those things. And that's how you practice, grow, and learn iteratively.
And iteratively, that's so amazing. That's exactly the question that I was going to ask, is the final amendment. What do you mean by iteratively there?
I mean, it's always a practice is not something that you do once and then you've done it. A practice is something that you assume on a regular basis and you hone skills. That's why discipline, not in a punishing discipline, but discipline in like the focus to continue practicing, is I think a very artful approach of life.
I love that. And I mean, I also see, just for a lot of my college age students that I'm working with, like loneliness, I can't remember where the statistic came from, but loneliness is at an all-time high. Anxiety and sadness, all-time high. And, you know, when I'm tired, I'm going to pull up my Instagram and TikTok feed and I'm going to scroll through this until I'm even more tired.
Right.
And then I'm going to eat some food. And now I'm like, I think there's a big challenge here in terms of the environment and the culture. And the other thing that I'm thinking of I was an only child. I had a couple good friends growing up, but I also really liked Calvin and Hobbes. And I remember feeling like I had a friend not in Calvin and Hobbes actually, but in Bill Watterson. There's something about the fact that this, like, still just remember that feeling. Like, how did he do this? I feel like we care about the same thing. As however a 5-year-old would frame that. That's what it felt like to me. And so I wonder if we're on the trail of how to use reading as a practice, reading and writing for friendship's sake. Where it's like, you know what, you might be, I'm gonna take it from an only child who feels like he has a lot of friends.
Oh my gosh.
Who read, right?
Thematically, I can't believe, I think Heidegger. Is Heidegger coming to me right now? I rarely go to Heidegger. But I'm thinking like Heidegger because the phrases like being with is what is coming up. Like when you're scrolling the feeds and everything and the alienation, that loneliness, the exhaustion, disconnection, it's like all of these things are the antithesis of a different kind of being, which is being with. And so we can be with books and others through different mediums too, that I do think facilitate some sense of proximity and closeness. And I'm so excited we're going here because I really wanted to make an honorable mention in this. I'm going to get there though. We're going to go on a little loop. So you were an only child having a sense of friendship and connection through Calvin and Hobbes, but not just with Calvin and Hobbes, right? Who's the author name?
Bill Watterson.
Bill Watterson. So in graduate school, did I ever tell you about the paper I wrote on Nietzsche about this?
I'm not sure.
So I don't remember a lot of the papers I wrote in graduate school. Most of them got criticized by faculty as not being philosophical enough. The only one that I really, really remember that didn't like get into anything, it wasn't part of my dissertation projects or anything like that, was a paper that I wrote about reading Nietzsche. And the overall idea was that like Nietzsche and I were friends and he loved me back. I was so about this that I had like a friend made me a shirt that said like Nietzsche loves me back because I was like committed to the idea. I'm like sitting in cafes reading Nietzsche, going like laughing and crying and be like, oh my God, he gets it.
He gets me.
And this is why I still firmly believe this. If someone reads Nietzsche and loves Nietzsche as much in the way that I love Nietzsche, I know that we're going to be fast friends. Like hands down, there's something about that connection where if you love Nietzsche the way I love Nietzsche, it says enough about you that I know we're going to connect. Because me reading him, I felt like not only did I feel like he saw me, I feel like he wanted me. Like he was like writing to someone like me to be able to hear him because he wanted a friend. He was a lonely guy. And And then I don't know, the Nietzschean love has always been this like question concept I've had for many years. Like, what does that even look like? I believe there's a concept of love in Nietzsche, and I call it Nietzschean love. But I was committed to the idea in that paper that Nietzsche and I were friends, and Nietzsche loves me back. So I'm going to table that for now, because like it didn't fly as a paper back then. I haven't revisited the arguments in a long time, but it was something I really like believed in. And it did relate to like what eventually I wanted to write my dissertation on, but didn't, but about like kind of the ways that certain ideas can connect with us and heal us or have an effect affectively on us. But the honorable mention I wanted to bring in here that I think is really special. You said, you know, does this lead back to reading or writing, and having friendship like through that? And I 100% think the answer is yes. So I'm going to be a little bit vulnerable here and just name that as a person, you were an only child. I was a middle child who felt always like I was like split. There were 2 complete families, and I was not of either of them in my family structure. So I think that that contributed a lot to my growing up sense of like, no one knows me, like no one sees me, or they see me as something that I'm not. And I have often wondered about the tension that gets created with all of the online content I've put out there for over a decade now. I mean, I've got a history, an archive of my own personal thoughts and feelings, many of which are quite vulnerable. Certainly there's some selective emphasis on what things I put out there and what I don't, but it's out there. And then I have all this stuff about me and my life out there on YouTube and on the internet and blogs and things. And it has at times exacerbated the painful feelings I have of people not seeing me because they think they know me from their interpretations of watching me with these videos. It causes issues with dating. It causes issues with meeting new people. People have all these ideas about me like, oh, that's so twisted. And yet it's also very real. So for someone who's like core hang up is like, do people really see me or not? Putting all that shit out there online is kind of a weird move. It's like a desperate, like, see me. And also like, but you don't see me because that's not really who I am. That's my online version that you're reading. But the cool thing is that
Love it.
Someone recently, there's a woman in Vietnam, and this is my honorable shout out to her. I'm so grateful for her because she has given me, like other people over the years, I've had people who've been supportive of my work and we've never met and I don't know them, but they're just like so generous and so lovely, and they surprise me all the time. But the most recent example is this woman in Vietnam who wrote me a letter a couple weeks ago. She found my work in the like spring, summer of 2020, and has articulated in a couple of, you know, messages back and forth on Instagram that it has been really meaningful for her to find a queer feminist voice articulating some of these perspectives that it's difficult to get full access to and shared thinking around in Vietnam. But she wrote this beautiful letter about her journey of finding my work and how much it's meant to her. And the amazing thing is that we've never talked. She's only been following my work for like a year and a half. And yet the way that she wrote this letter and what she shared about herself felt so authentic and real. Like I was just so grateful for it because it was truly an experience of like being seen and seeing another person. And I think it reflects a lot about who she is, her sensitivity, her attunement, her thought processes, and her own feelings and experience of knowing herself. But it was magical to be able to get a letter from a stranger that felt so comfortable, like so much like, yes, you know? And I think that she feels that way, and that's what compelled her to write the letter, but it's mutual in that, like, I see that too in the way that she has now reached out to me. I feel similarly grateful for the connection that we're sharing just because of who we are and nothing else. It's like wild. So I think that was a super affirming opportunity to say like, yeah, can there be friendship or relationship, some kind of connection strictly through the modes that we interact with, like reading and writing, whether that's across the globe or a century and a half away, in the case of like Nietzsche, you know? I think it's really powerful, but I love thinking about that.
That's amazing. It's like, it's a real-time Nietzsche loves me back moment where you're Nietzsche.
It finally happened. Thanks for confirming my most like mad ideas. Like, I think I'm Nietzsche. Oh my God, I'm becoming Nietzsche. Am I Nietzsche reincarnated? This is just messed up. Sometimes in my darkest moments of disconnect from reality, I start to wonder where the lines really are between me and Nietzsche.
It's a dangerous line of inquiry.
I know. Well, I embraced madness in the spring of 2020. I said, this is how I go mad, and bring it on. And look at me now.
It's working out okay.
I know we have to wrap up because we're almost out of time.
We are, and I feel like the final point that's interesting, given that last turn in friendship, is this is non-judgmental zone as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not, and if we're going to be a good friend to ourselves, we're not going to preemptively judge our madness, quote unquote, anxiety, depression, even not own them as being mine, but something, I love that phrase. Instead of saying I have depression, being able to articulate there are feelings of depression arising in the impermanent process I call myself, which is a more accurate way of actually understanding what's going on through our language. So I think that's the final piece that I wanted to throw in here, is the non-evaluative, open, you said patience with a friend, and how we can have that across time and space. I love where we ended up. Second time, it feels like we just have got to this really rich point that could springboard into another conversation, which is probably why this is the 10th time we've had a conversation like this.
Yeah. I think this leads into a sense of liberatory love. It's a major pillar of thought for me that I focus on a lot, of what liberation looks like in a loving dynamic, in a loving relationship.
Yes.
And to your point about like non-judgment, yeah, I really think that like friendship is about like the willingness and capacity to embrace just what is. It's like a presence that comes with that non-judgment of being able to see and be seen like presently with a person for everything. So we can do that with ourselves, and we can do that with others too. Because I know you said last time, I wouldn't want to follow Nietzsche into the woods. And I was like, but Nietzsche's just going to the woods.
Yeah, and you said another really telling thing, that he wants me back, that we were wanted, that there is a sense of affection as well, that I want you the way that you are.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, that's.
And I want you to be the way that you are. That move is. We're just hungry for that. Especially when we put out all this content that makes it harder for people to understand what we are.
Is it harder though? Because I'm trying.
I don't think so.
It's like
I don't
so
think
easy.
so. It's pretty clear. No, I don't know. Well, Cori, thank you. I appreciate it as well. I have more energy than when we started, which is my mark of a good conversation for sure. And if people want to support your work, what's the best way to do that?
My website, CoriWong.com, or support, buy me a coffee / buymeacoffee.com/Cori.
We'll put the link. I'll put the link in the show notes. We'll also put the themes and topics. And if you have questions or ideas that you want to go further, please feel free to reach out to us. I have the only thing I wrote in all caps in my notes, and it's bolded. Our values are not a side hustle. So we're going to write something on that. So I think that's brilliant. And I really appreciate the sense of communion that I feel. And with that being said,
thank you.
Thank you. Let's wish you an amazing 2022, and we're going to hopefully keep this conversation going. That was great.
Yeah. Same to you. Be well.
Thank you very much. If you're still watching this, thanks for subscribing or liking, and we'll see you all later.